In September of this year, it was anticipated that the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, would petition the United Nations to recognize an autonomous Palestinian state in Palestine. And it was anticipated that this would, rather than help solve the problem in the Middle East, that this would just exacerbate the problems. During that week, as I watched various news shows and observed different Palestinian representatives speak, one word that came across again and again and again was that Israel occupied the land of their forefathers. They were occupied. It was an apartheid state. And so the question is, how are we to understand the realities of these claims that Israel is occupying the West Bank and that Israel is fostering an apartheid state in the West Bank? If that is true, then certainly the Israeli nation is one of the most horrible, oppressive regimes in all of history. If it's not true, then the Palestinian Authority is fostering a huge fraud on the international community. And as long as this problem between the so-called Palestinian people and the Israelis continue, there will continue to be turmoil in the Middle East. So we need to investigate these claims. Why is Israel called an apartheid state? Who is really occupying Palestine? Why does Israel not stop these settlements? I mean, again and again and again, we hear these complaints that Israel continues to build and build and build in the West Bank, and especially in East Jerusalem. So what is the real story? How do we determine who is the real occupier of the land of Palestine? Well, first of all, we have to understand something about the story that we've all heard about the Middle East and explaining these events. So we have to go back to the events that occurred in 1967. In 1967, there was a war between Israel and Egypt and Syria and Jordan called the Six-Day War. The story goes that Israel captured the West Bank from the Palestinians in the Six-Day War. Then they refused the orders of the UN to give the land back to the Palestinians, that Israel had no claim whatsoever on Judea and Samaria, the area that is usually called the West Bank. Therefore, the claim is that Israel has illegally occupied this territory, and they have built illegal settlements there and illegal settlements in East Jerusalem. So what really happened in 1967? This is so important to understand. First of all, in May of that year, Egypt and Syria began to mass their troops on the border with Israel. At the end of May, Jordan signed a defense treaty with Egypt. Then Egypt, which at that time controlled the Sinai Peninsula, ordered the UN peacekeeping forces completely out of the Sinai Peninsula. They closed the Gulf of Aqaba to Israeli shipping, which is a violation of international law and clearly a preparation for war. And then in response to weeks of threats and this military buildup, Israel, in a brilliant surprise attack against Egypt, destroyed their air force on the ground within a matter of hours. And this enabled them to defeat these three Arab nations in the next 6 days. Jordan attacked Israel and came in from the east across the Jordan River, had the territory that they already controlled in the West Bank, and attacked Israel, but Israel defeated them and pushed the Jordanian army back across the Jordan River. So what we learned for this is, number one, the territory that Israel captured in 1967, that is Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, was captured in a justified war of self-defense. It did not previously belong to a Palestinian nation, for no Palestinian nation had ever existed in human history. Second, the land Israel captured had previously been part of the Kingdom of Jordan, and the inhabitants were called Jordanians and had Jordanian passports. How did Jordan control that land? How did Jordan come to be in control of that territory known as the West Bank? Well, this happened at the end of the Israeli War for Independence in 1947 to 49. Once again, this was a war that was fought by Israel in defense as they were attacked by 5 Arab nations. It began in April 26 of 1948 when Jordan's Arab Legion first attacked a Jewish village at Kfar Etzion. Following Israel's declaration of independence in May, the 5 Arab nations illegally attacked Israel. Israel was able to defeat all 5 of those Arab nations. An armistice agreement was signed between Israel and Jordan on April 3rd of 1949. This armistice established a temporary line of demarcation between Jordan and Israel, which became known as the Green Line. On the insistence of the Arab nations, this armistice specifically stated that this Green Line was not to be considered a border. Why? Because the Arabs wanted more land. They never envisioned the fact that the Israelis would become more powerful and come east across that line. They wanted it guaranteed that this would not be considered a border. So when President Obama, when Mahmoud Abbas, when others say we need to start with the 1967 line, this is in complete violation of the wording of the Armistice Agreement of 1949. These maps show the significance of that line. In the map on the left, you see the area shaded in yellow, the big bulge there in the middle of Israel. That's the area that was formerly part of Jordan. This was the area that was captured by Israel and is now called the West Bank. In the right map, you see how this green line bisects Jerusalem, dividing it into West Jerusalem, the area in the red, and East Jerusalem, the area in the green. You'll notice that there is a brown square near the center of the map. This is the area of the Old City, the area where all of the holy sites related to Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are located. During the time that East Jerusalem was under the control of the Kingdom of Jordan, no Christians and no Jews were allowed to visit their holy sites at all. It was completely closed off. If this territory is to be given to a so-called Palestinian state, then what would happen is that all of these wonderful holy sites, all this wonderful area that has been such a treasure trove of archaeological finds, will all be cut off from Christian and Jewish exploration. So, in 1967, you had Israel, in a war of self-defense, take control of the West Bank from not the Palestinians, but from the Kingdom of Jordan. So who owned that land prior to the Kingdom of Jordan? The Kingdom of Jordan's authority over that land was never recognized by any international court of law. It was never recognized by any other nation. It was theirs only by conquest. But who owned it before they did? Well, that is a fascinating story. The last legal ownership that most people are aware of for that land was the Ottoman Empire. In the map, you see that the area shaded in red is the area that was part of the Ottoman Empire, and that included this area of Jordan as well as the area of Palestine. But you will note that there's no designation of a Palestine on this map. There was no nation Palestine. There were no Palestinian peoples. There was simply a region of Syria that had territorial authority extending down into the northern part of what we now call Israel, and then the other area south of there was part of a regional administration that was referred to as Palestine. But there's no state, there's no people called Palestinian. With the end of World War I, it was necessary to determine what to do with these territories that had been previously controlled and dominated by the Ottoman Empire for 400 years, going back to the mid-1400s. And so it is at this time that you have a decision made at the end of World War I to meet together for the international powers, to meet together in Italy in order to determine the breakup of these nations, where the new borders would be, and to establish them. They had the international authority to do so. Previous to that time, before the end of World War I, the British War Council had met and issued a policy statement that later became known as the Balfour Declaration, because it was written by Lord Arthur Balfour, written to Lord Rothschild, the head of the representative of the Jewish Zionist organization in Britain. And in there he states that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home. That is a technical term at that time in history for a nation. So Britain's policy was that they wanted to help the Jewish people return back to their historic homeland to reestablish the nation Israel. In fact, that term, to reestablish their nation, was inserted into the later San Remo Treaty. So it was that original statement, that policy statement known as the Balfour Declaration, that is the foundation for the later legal decision at San Remo to establish a homeland for the Jewish people. The area in this map that's shaded in tan color is the area that was divided up at San Remo for Syria, for the Hashemite kingdom of Transjordan at that time, for a Palestinian homeland, and for Saudi Arabia. In April of 1920, the Allied powers met at San Remo, Italy, to establish these boundaries for Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Prior to this time, none of those places existed, as well as a national homeland for the Jewish people. They also established what they called mandates, or mandatories, that is, legally designated authority to France and to Britain to oversee or supervise these territories until the native people were able to govern themselves. And each area had different stipulations. So the San Remo resolution designated that all of the land east and west of the Jordan was to be a national home for the Jewish people. This had previously been part of the Ottoman Empire. And this map shows all of the territory originally given to the Jewish people. However, in 1922, the British government believed that it was necessary to divide this in order to pay off a war debt to King Faisal, and so the area on the east of the Jordan, the area shaded in yellow, was given to the Arab peoples for their homeland. But all the land west of the Jordan was given to the Jewish people for the national homeland. So the Arabs had Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Arabia, Iraq, all of those areas for their homeland, and just a small sliver was left as a national homeland for the Jewish people. But then, in 1947, the UN, in a vote, UN Resolution 181, voted to partition Israel, the national area designated for Israel, even more. The area shaded in gray was to go to the Arab people, and the area shaded in green was to go to the Jewish people. And this was even a further reduction of the territory to be reserved for the people. But in light of San Remo, even that decision was illegal. It was a non-binding resolution, and it was rejected by the Arabs. Instead, they attacked Israel in the spring of 1948. And at the end of that war, Jerusalem was further divided, and so we must recognize that all of Jerusalem was originally designated to be part of the Jewish national homeland by San Remo, and no decision, not UN Resolution 181, not any other decision, Oslo or any other decision, has the authority to remove or to change the decision made at San Remo. So what have we learned? We've learned that the territory that Israel captured in 1967, Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, was Jordanian territory, not Palestinian territory. Jordan, in fact, had occupied that territory from 1949 until 1967. Jordan was the occupation. Before 1948, the West Bank was given to the Jewish people as a national homeland by the international law of the San Remo Resolution in 1920. Any attempt by the UN to recognize a Palestinian state, therefore, is a violation of international law. The Palestinian Authority, Fatah and Hamas, are indeed the interlopers. They are the ones who are occupying land that by all international law belongs as a national homeland to the Jewish people. For further study, if you want to get into the technicalities of this, I suggest you read these two books. The first is The Legal Foundation and Borders of Israel Under International Law, and the second is The Sovereignty Over the Old City of Jerusalem by Jacques Gauthier.